live in 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, Micah, we are on. Let me just post this on my Facebook again. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon if you're in Southeast Asia. I am Zarni. I'm hosting the FORSEA dialogue on democratic struggles across Southeast Asia. I've got a distinct pleasure to have my old friend and a very distinguished Burma scholar, Professor Michael Charney of the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's also a board member of our Southeast Asia Academic and Activist Network, FORSEA. Welcome, Mike.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me, Charney.
Yeah. So we are to talk about, the coup that took place yesterday that apparently has, in quotes, shocked the world. That was the leads, or one of the lead stories yesterday, headline news. And I think yesterday, the new U.S. President Joe Biden issued a statement saying that his administration is reviewing Burma policy with respect to the sanctions, because of the coup. Can you walk us through how we got here? Because we've been told, the world has been told that Burma was an extraordinary example of how authoritarian regimes transform itself into a democracy that could be emulated, according to Obama, by regimes like Iran or North Korea. How do we get here?
Well, first, can I preface this? There's been a lot of conversations in the past 2 days, yesterday and today, and there's a lot of motion and people take things. You have a lot of hit and run trolling and this kind of thing, and a lot of people are taking things at superficial levels. So I think I should preface this first that untangling this, deconstructing this, by no means supports what the military did or the military takeover. Just pointing out the facts and everything is not to legitimate what they did or to justify what they did. It is to untangle how we got here. That's the whole point of breaking all of this down. So let me just
stop you there. I think I saw this really nasty note directed at you specifically from one Mel Reynaud. I believe he's a French or Belgian French national, working in the NGO sector in Burma. It's quite a nasty note, because I saw your explanation on Facebook as well, trying to explain that this isn't an average coup. This is within the Burmese constitutional context. This is quote unquote constitutional and legal, and the entity, the military that staged the coup, was actually constitutionally assigned to stage a coup. But the problem is, the people who operate within the so-called fragile democratic transition framework, they should have known better, because this is the whole point of military keeping this, qualifying their process as a disciplined flourishing rather than, normal, democratic self-governing process. So anyway, just want to support your position that you are trying to explain, as a historian and a scholar of Burma, what transpired, and then you got attacked, and someone, I think you wrote something like "fuck you, Mike" or something.
Well, I did. I was told to burn in hell, but we can leave all the trolls out of this. But to encapsulate this generally, this is the big problem: is that for a while now, there have been a number of people trying to sell contemporary Burma as a safe place to invest, as a place that's on a genuine path to transition to democracy. Yeah, Aung San Suu Kyi is on the right path. It was good that she engaged with the military and joined the new government and elections, and in November demonstrated that we're on the right path. We're going towards full democracy, and that was all fallacious. There's never been a point at which the military wasn't going to have control. This has always been the case. I explained to someone yesterday, what we've seen since 1962 is constant reiterations of different forms of military rule. And they play a game for 5 to 12 years. They set up a new government or a new leadership, and then they extend the hope, the carrot, that everything will eventually lead to change and prosperity and freedom and everything else. And then as soon as things start to look like they will shift away from military control, they suddenly change the rules of the game or change entirely the game again. And that's what's happened now since 2008 with the Constitution, and then the transition governments after and leading up to Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD right now. We've been on another one of these runs, another one of these joy trips. And at the point that it started to feel the current the current Chief General Min Aung Hlaing, as soon as he started to feel that maybe military control might be in doubt, that Aung San Suu Kyi or the NLD was getting too much popularity, that or a number of other factors as well, that they might lose power, they've changed the game again. So we're back to another military control for a year. Now, just to demonstrate why this is just another military game, look at the Constitution, the one that Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD willingly bought into. The Constitution provides for the kind of takeover that we have seen right now. This is totally according to the Constitution. And this isn't to say there's any support for that. I don't support military control. What I'm saying is don't cry about it now. Look into the Constitution. They're playing things out according to how things are spelled in the Constitution. Get informed, read the Constitution before assuming it's like the US Constitution or some other democratic constitution. This is not a coup in the same way it would be a coup in another country. It's a place where the government already had really control, and it's just it's taken a corrective step. This is not the kind of bloody revolution that you might see in another country. So this is how we got into where we are right now, is the myth that we've had a democracy in place that had any chance of evolving into something more real. And all we've seen is an expected move by the military to counter anything that would shake that game up.
Yeah, I think Aung San Suu Kyi herself in Burmese language, or at least a statement attributed to her, and also verified by some of the closest co-founders of the NLD, like ex-Captain Win Thein and the NLD spokesperson and others. But apparently Suu Kyi, or Aung San Suu Kyi, the mention about the Constitution, but while she, towards the end of her, the statement attributed to her, called for the electorate to oppose the coup. Didn't specify how they should oppose it, but she definitely called on the Burmese public to oppose the military coup. But she, in that Burmese language statement, she mentioned that she was aware of the unsatisfactory, I mean that's a euphemism from my part, nature of the Constitution, because the Constitution is fundamentally and categorically anti-democratic. I mean, like we all study constitutions in different countries and history of democratization, and the whole purpose of constitutional politics is to ensure that there are checks and balances. No individual or no institution, whether the church or the queen or the king or the commons, did not have a monopoly over a single state, right? And so the Burmese Constitution of 2008 is really antithesis of what a constitutionalist politics would be, right? Because the Constitution places the military above the law, above popular will. Yeah, and also the military, as I said earlier, qualified their kind of democracy. They call it disciplined, flourishing democracy, right? And forgive the English here, but they're basically assigned by their own constitution to be disciplinarians, right? It's very, very, like what military has been doing is actually crystal clear, very clear, that they are not interested in liberal democracy or any system that could be called a democracy at all. I think, what happened yesterday, from my perspective, is that, the Suu Kyi and NLD party veer too far from the narrow path that the military has set out for them. So they step in and, like schoolmasters, whipping the students. Well, the problem is that the military wasn't just simply caning a few bad apples that did not obey or listen, right, comply with the military's wishes. They expelled the whole school, right? I mean, that's a scenario, right? I mean, because they're serving as the regents, yeah. They are the referee, they are the player, right? They're everything, because they don't like this game, because they cannot no longer play this game and defeat Aung San Suu Kyi in her own game. So they changed, they changed it. But why did if you and I, ordinary the scholars or in my case, activists, can see through what the military justification for this and what their strategic ends are, why aren't the entire bloc of Western democracies, why aren't the United Nations and why aren't other international bodies cannot see this? Why are they acting shocked?
Well, for most, they're not actually interested in the well-being of everyday Burmese. They're interested in larger state games and geopolitical strategies. And the big concern for Western countries is the PRC right now and the One Belt, One Road. And for Japan, it's not the population of Burma either. They're concerned about China and trying to push the free Indo-Pacific area. These larger games are being played right now. It's not about what's good for the Burmese themselves. So we will have, the other thing is that the world, because it doesn't pay a lot of attention to what's actually happening on the ground, they're happy if things are relatively stable. When things flare up like this, they don't actually have a deep understanding of what's happening. And so they hear words like coup thrown around and they're suddenly going to react. We know nobody's really going to, there's not much that's going to be done by the UN Security Council, that it'll be blocked by China or Russia. But but yes, they aren't carefully going through the Burmese of history, picking it apart and figuring out what's actually at work here. One of the big problems I find too is that you've got a fundraising machinery already in place that's built around Burma, and anytime there's an episode like this, suddenly it's seen as an opportunity to make money, and you hear the cha-ching, cha-ching, and suddenly this has been mobilized to get everybody to start donating money to some organization that's somehow going to have an impact on, and it has no impact. You just lose your money to these groups. So there are legitimate groups out there, but just be careful of the ones who come hand in hand very quickly for this. And these people, and I would say a lot of the actual NLD political supporters, both at home and abroad, they are the ones who are playing a big role right now, trying to discourage any kind of deconstruction of what's happening, any kind of debate, any type of looking at the details. Because, and I've seen this over and over again in the past 24 hours, the argument is that we can't muddy the waters with this. It's clearly bad military against good NLD and good Aung San Suu Kyi. Don't bring up the Rohingya. Don't question the constitutionality of or raise the issue of whether Aung San Suu Kyi was responsible for buying into this constitution. You can't take any type of critical note here. We have to go back to the old pre-2010, 2011 period when Aung San Suu Kyi was the liberal freedom icon for the world. And she's lost those credentials. She doesn't have those anymore. And I think that's what they're sorely missing right now. They think we're going to go back to those days and the world is all going to join together and unify bloc. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, Mike, sorry to interrupt. I see this double Orwellian discourse at work now. On the one hand, like what you're saying is absolutely correct. Like let's purify the Burmese civil society. Let's purify. Let's cleanse Aung San Suu Kyi of any kind of like a wrongdoing. In the Rohingya genocide, right? And as genocides are not just simply crimes of passion. They're premeditated, state-directed, and pre-planned. But no states can successfully execute genocidal policies without the popular support. That's why propaganda became extremely crucial, whether we're talking about Nazi Germany or the Balkans or the Rwanda or the Burmese genocide against the Rohingyas. And so that's one narrative. One is like, okay, all right, there is this like admirable pro-democracy, pro-human rights of Burmese civil society led by the iconic Aung San Suu Kyi, right? That was the old narrative. And I was part of the narrative, I worked in that movement for like, almost 15 years as a foot soldier. Now, the other the other Orwellian that's at work is here as well. Well, basically the former Orwellian that we just mentioned is the military bad, Aung San Suu Kyi good, Burmese society good, right? So we puncture that the myth that civil society is inherently positive, progressive, and emancipatory. Right? That's not true. We know this in the context of Rohingya genocide, because both the Burmese military-run state and political parties and the civil society are all guilty in the genocide. Yeah. And then like there's another the narrative that's Orwellian, that's put out by the Burmese military, right? Which is that this is the coup that is designed to protect and defend democracy. I mean, like this is a classic Orwellian. This like war is peace, kind of thing, right? And so the military has presented this, and yesterday in May Online's like office statement. That they undertook this measure, very drastic and radical measure, because they needed to preserve the democratic transition. And Suu Kyi and NLD have become power maniac, unprincipled, and even anti-democrat, right? So the generals presenting themselves as defenders of the democracy, and Aung San Suu Kyi and her colleagues, whatever their complicity in the genocide, they spend years behind bars or under house arrest, right? And then these people who cried democracy for 20 years, they're presented in this Orwellian narrative coming from the commander-in-chief's office as anti-Christ. I mean, like, this is like really extraordinary, right? So let's talk about the role of basically scholars and commentators and experts that worked on Burma for years, right? And their role in creating these like myths, whether the Suu Kyi good, military bad, or Burma is a democratic inner fragile transition with Suu Kyi as its spearhead. Don't rock the boat. I mean, who are these people? I have my own list of people that I have watched for so long who contributed to the manufacturing of the military controlled political transition as fragile democracy.
Yeah, well, it is an amazing phenomenon to have seen and to have been part of, actually, because for a long time I was Aung San Suu Kyi supporter, and very critical of the military and for much of this period, but always with a degree of skepticism, always with a critical angle for myself. But almost like a cult grew around Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's what happens if you focus too much on a personality and not on the issues and not on Burma, but you're so focused on this person under house arrest for years and years and turn them into a modern Burmese version of Gandhi. For example, you lose all critical assessment. And so you had, as soon as any move that she made would be because she made the move, that was a good move. because she made this move, that was the right step in the direction of democracy without any critical assessment of what was happening. So that group still remained in charge, and once she came into power, it kind of dominated. It came to dominate the whole discourse on Burma. So when we had the military attack the Rohingya in August 2017, the genocide that they began, and it had gone on for a while before that, it just didn't get the world attention that it should have intensified. She was denying the whole thing. She was out there, and something all of us had to deny it too. And I challenge you to look for, okay, right now we're seeing on social media lots of Western academics write anti-military things and anti-this and anti-that, and they're out there sending their support to everyday Burmese and Burmese scholars in Burma in these current conditions where nobody, as I understand, there hasn't really been any bloodshed in this current action, unless you know of something I don't know. It has not been in that kind of situation. However scary all these always are, it's not been anything compared to what happened in August 2017 in Rakhine. They're sending all their support now, but they were completely silent during the genocide that was taking place. They said nothing. They all of a sudden during the genocide, well, we're scholars and we're academics and we're this, and we shouldn't talk about political issues. But now it raises the issue to me that a lot of these people have been, that their views of Burma have been constructed by an area studies paradigm, that they see things through the eyes of the state, that when they think of real Burmese, they're thinking of Burmese Buddhists, Bamars, who dominate 62 or 63% of the population, and they don't consider anyone else in the country as equal to that group. And I would essentially say that this is largely, I would call this group racist. I would say that they would be the same thing about foreign supporters of Trump and the Proud Boys, and the only we don't recognize it like that because the discourse hasn't reached that level yet. So right now we're really seeing is a large part of the discourse dominated still by Aung San Suu Kyi supporters who are very restricted in what they see as being Myanmar, what they see as being Burmese, who has rights and who does not. They care about Aung San Suu Kyi and the Bamars losing to the military, but they didn't care that the Rohingya were attacked or pushed out of the country or raped or anything else, or at least they weren't willing to stand up to that. I should also I also want to point out one more thing. One thing to highlight what's happening right now is that when the attacks were taking place on Muslims in Myanmar and against Rakhine, you saw lots of mass gatherings of people out there waving banners and everything else. And then right now in the current situation, when Aung San Suu Kyi called on the masses to stand up against the military, right now the streets are empty. Nobody's out. Nobody came out. And I think it's a silly excuse to say it's because they're under lockdown because of COVID. The fact is that people, the large part of the politics, domestic politics, the view in Burma, in Yangon, Naypyidaw, and other major Burma centers, it's very hostile to Muslims. It's very racist. They're willing to come out to attack Muslims, but they're not willing to stand up for the government.
No, I think although we'll definitely get to that. I mean, just suffice it to say now, I think Aung San Suu Kyi herself was responsible for the sorry state of the strength of civil society. She's been known to be very autocratic in her dealings with anyone other than the generals, right? Because generals are more powerful, so she can't be dictating them around. But the rest of the Burmese civil society, NGOs or CBCS, community-based organizers, CBOs, or individual, or more genuinely, radical activists on the ground, students and whatnot. She's basically kept them at bay at best, and essentially she has contributed to the state of a neuter state of the Burmese civil society. I mean, and so in times like this, when she really needs the Burmese society coming out by the thousands in different cities across Burma, there is nobody, because she has marginalized the civil society, because she moved into this politics of autocracy. She's making deals unilaterally with either the generals or the Chinese in Beijing or the UN bodies or whatever. But
if I can just interject before you move on about this point, I think that the big problem for her, the big strategic mistake she made was there's an article yesterday, I think by Christoph, on how she's failed twice. She's failed Burma twice. And one is she'd lost moral credibility because of the Rohingya situation. And then she lost the real politic game because of what's happened now. And I think she actually lost it when she joined the government. I think she had immense international popularity and domestic popularity, and she had a huge moral edge. Whether she deserved that or not, but she was attributed with a huge moral edge. And then she decided to participate in the government.
Yeah.
Now, she would have been much better off had she stayed out and opposed this constitution as being a bad constitution.
Yeah, I want to say make a few points here. One is that, you mentioned about cultism, and how that affected the Burmese commentators, or like the Burma Studies crowd, right? And they don't want to do anything that would upset but before Suu Kyi was big or in power, they didn't want to do anything that would upset the state, the military, the generals, right? They kept quiet about Aung San Suu Kyi being under house arrest, or students being thrown in jail by the thousands, or like the dissidents being forced into exile, right? And then, like when she, became a powerful figure from the civilian politician side, they also steer clear of upsetting Aung San Suu Kyi, right? And now, I think the cultism, and people like yourself and myself, you were really good friends with her older son.
We should not talk about my personal life. Let's leave that aside.
Yeah. No. So I mean, we had. I mean, when I left Burma in 1988, just before uprising, 1 month before, I brought essentially three small pictures, a pocket size, in my wallet. One was a picture that my father made of with a little Buddhist prayers printed on the back. The picture of this Rakhine Buddha, we call it Mahamuni in Mandalay, because it was basically war loot from 1785, right? And I had that because I was raised Buddhist, a good Buddhist boy. I was 24. The second picture was a small family picture of my family, and the third picture was black and white picture of Suu Kyi and her two brothers and Aung San and his wife Daw Khin Chee. Yeah. So I had that such emotional bond with her, although I had never met her at the point. Yeah, but my mother's uncle was her father's very close classmates at the Pigou Hall in the 1930s at Rangoon University. And they also lived immediate next door to each other at the residence there. And the minute I cut free of myself from this cultist sentiment. I was able to see things a lot more clear. It's no longer whatever she says, I will support that position, right? And then when I saw her in 2012 in London at the LSE event, I slipped her a note, and basically I just told her, Auntie, I tried to work with some of these generals, and I also came from an extended military family. You cannot do business with these guys. This was 2012. Yeah. I wrote that, I typed a very, very short message and put it in a brown envelope, gave it to her chief of security detail, who was also arrested yesterday along with her. Yeah. And then like U Win Tin, yeah. The one of the key co-founders and intellectual the figure or intellectual force behind the creation of NLD, also was very much opposed to Aung San Suu Kyi and accepting the military's constitution. U Win Tin is no more. And so she has ignored every single piece of strategic advice from those who admire and loved and respected her, including U Win Tin. And forget about me. I was just nobody from the street, an activist. They've co-founded this party. She ignored him, right?
Yeah.
And now we found ourselves in this situation where, the big lie of 10 years that, Burma is transitioning into some kind of democracy under her leadership, despite the fact that the military has made it impossible to have any type of like a proper functioning democracy. So now you mentioned about the genocide and the Burma scholar people looking Burma in a very racist and a very statist manner, right? So they talk about democratization, the majority Burma and the quote unquote proper Burma, right? The civil war, the vicious military attacks against the Kachins or Karans or Rakhine Buddhists even, don't enter into a legitimate scholarly discussion, right? No. And also like genocides also not enter into it, but that comes to reflect, that is reflected in the policy statements and condemnations coming from, say, even like, the President Biden's statement did not mention genocide, did not mention the military's attacks against other minorities. The same goes for, the Foreign Office here in UK or European Union statements, right? I think this idea that we can isolate democratization and human rights of the majority from the genocide, from the colonial war against the minority is another farce. From now on, how do we create a situation where Burma cannot be discussed without talking about three things: repression of the mainstream Burmese society, the genocide against the Rohingyas, and colonial wars against ethnic minorities? How do we facilitate this? Because this isn't going anywhere.
Well, that has been the big part of the problem, and I really believe that many people they bought so much into the cult that they're totally blind to the inadequacy of the position, the contradictions, they act shocked right now. I'm sure they are shocked, but they're talking about how we have this crisis in Burma that suddenly emerged. Well, no, this crisis has been going on for 3.5 years now. You just ignored it. You were and that comes from this privileged position of the Bamars, the Bamar Burmese-speaking Buddhist majority. It comes to only caring about them. So when we talk about democracy, the only standard is how much the Bamars have, not how much the Burmese have. When we talk about safety in Burma, well, it's safe for everybody as long as it's okay for the major cities and the Bamar majority. They don't care what's happening to the Shan or the Kachin or the Karen or to the Rakhine Buddhists even, or to the certainly not to the Rohingya. So this really, I think this type of attitude where we all have to get on board now for the crisis that just happened really, really underscores the degree of racism that we have in other people. And I don't know if they're even conscious of that, but isn't much of the racism often an unconscious problem that you had to raise people's awareness about so they self-educate and they drop those types of attitudes. I think the other part of the problem is a lot of people profit from Burma since we've had the new constitution, the new governments. You have not everybody in Burma, you have a lot of people who are working very hard in Myanmar, foreigners and domestic activists and so on who are working very hard, but you also have a class of carpetbaggers, foreigners who've come in just to profit. And so they wanted the world to stop the sanctions and everything else as quickly as possible. They wanted as much investment as possible. They wanted the open doors so that they could sit in Yangon and hang around pools and meet and eat and drink and draw huge salaries. That's part of the problem. These people are trying to restrict a lot of the conversation about this too. So all of these things mean that we leave the Rohingya out. We leave the fact that Myanmar hasn't been a good place for a long time, not since yesterday, but certainly for parts of the country and for much of the population for years and years and years now. How do we prevent this in the future? I think we need to, number one, area studies lot of the people who try to speak with expertise are area studies scholars. A lot of us, I've been through area studies programs, and that all has to be reinvented in the West. It is totally biased in favor of the needs of what's good for states, how they can understand international security, produce experts you can send in and help the states, the United States, set up policies and deal with issues from a view that's going to benefit their diplomatic, IR, their relationships. We need to reinvent area studies so it has a much more holistic idea of culture and language and religion, that it has a much broader remit for who deserves political rights and who doesn't. We're not in the stage anymore where we're dealing with small embryonic classes of people that are going to try to grow and then build a larger civil society around. We're at the point now where everybody is aware of the rights they should have, and that creates problems when you don't have a broad dissemination of civil liberties and freedoms and so on. I'd like to add something else too, and this is about the big strategic mistake again that Aung San Suu Kyi made joining the government. And this, to be fair, this isn't looking back. This isn't retrospective, perfect vision. This is things we said at the time and in advance of it happening, that the military would benefit from this because all of a sudden they could have charge of the border areas that they wanted. They could still have a significant say over the government, veto. They could still, their families, a lot of them are involved in businesses, could still profit very well. But the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi would take the moral hit for everything that the military did.
Well,
they would. No, that's what I'm saying is we were saying that from the beginning. Under this constitution, military gets to do what it wants. It's a perfect deal for them. And the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi and the Burma people take the moral hit for everything that they do that's wrong. And that's been the problem. The problem with this constitution did not begin yesterday. It began from the very beginning. She should never join this. She should have stood the moral high ground. But she made a decision to go after as her route, power in which she could be very comfortable and gradually grow the democratic space and benefit very personally from them.
Yeah, of all the people that we may have in mind, or we will put in different categories of, the legitimizers, like policy legitimizers and or propagandists, right? Through their writings, op-eds, commenting as TV commentators and whatnot, or policy advisors that go into foreign offices from the back door or front door, whatever. I think, she is most responsible because, she was at some point, for the longest time as an iconic figure, they're seen as someone who could walk on water, right? And it has this, impeccable moral and intellectual integrity that Aung San Suu Kyi would not lie, right? And so when she endorsed the military's big lie that they were serious about democratizing the country and reforms, right there, she was complicit. She knew that this is not something that she could live with. But you can simply make up political calculations that based on prayers and wishful thinkings. But that's precisely what she ended up doing in hindsight, right? And here I want to bring us something. I think there are, Burmese and long-term area study people, that are well known, that have taken this, very narrow-minded, statist, selective understanding of Burma. I'm going to name names because it's important. This is not out of malice or.
I won't comment on individuals, but you can.
Yeah, say for instance, Robert Taylor, right, and. The former the professor at SOAS. Taylor for the longest time was responsible for peddling this statist perspective. Another one is David Steinberg at Georgetown. These are people I knew personally, but they've been peddling this, Burmese statist, military's perspective. This is the only legitimate way to have to formulate a Burma policy. And everything else is periphery, whether, minority, armed groups or like the, the dissidents on the at the grassroots level, we're all like irrelevant. What really matter is who controls the state, and then we will finesse our analyses to fit the demands of state power, right? So now, I mean, these are old gods that they are going away, but we've got new crops of Burma experts coming in, and then you talk about like their view restricted to urban centers where they could sit around and sip cocktails or do like disco or whatnot, or do like basically there's a multifold increase of Burma experts, yeah, over the last 10 years. And then, I'll be very honest that, at the risk of sounding arrogant here, most of what comes out of their mouth or what comes out of their tip of their pen is utter rubbish. Yeah, that's been like, that's been made respectable by the fact that they are in the media. They're quoted by New York Times and Wall Street. I mean, like you could have people like, Pham Nhat Ui. You don't need to name them. I know these people personally. Yeah. How could a historian misunderstand Burmese history? And most important, the historical institution, which is the military that has been playing king and kingmakers alternately, right? How could he possibly misunderstand this when he starts selling, this like a fake, discourse of the, top-down democratization by the military? I mean, I remember like, him, selling this as a baby step, well, like, they're using the language discourse of, well, like, perfect is the enemy of the good. And so this is not perfect. Yeah, but you need to accept it. And, Tham Nhat was a very influential figure, grandson of the late UN General Secretary, very polished speaker, and we were really close friends. And like, they were selling these. It's the Burmese as well as international scholars selling the monkey meat, for whatever their calculation. Or how could a historian misunderstand the Burmese history? I mean, like, I think that what I want to say here is that the big lie did not pop out of the sky. It was then simply the military that was able to sell this. There are so many, scholars and professional commentators, NGO. Yesterday, Human Rights Watch issued a statement condemning the coup using the term fragile democracy. Yeah? I mean, like, this is like a human rights NGO, for God's sake. You know what I mean? And I think we really need to fight this at the level of intellectual and policy analysis. That we cannot let another 30 years go repeat themselves with the same false narrative, and that at the end of another 10 year, we've got another a new Orwellian paradigm coming in.
Well, if we took this from an intellectual standpoint and a field standpoint, you have to remember that there are multiple narratives of Burmese history, and it depends on whose perspective and what social group. Elites are going to see things very differently than people in the village, and people in Rakhine will see things very differently than people in Naypyidaw. A lot of the older scholars that you mentioned, to speak about that field, were political scientists, and they came out of political science at a time when the state was it. That was the state paradigm was triumphant. State is coming back. Actually, state has trumped the human rights paradigm.
Yeah, thanks to COVID.
Well, it was already starting, but COVID helped a lot. COVID is the state's best friend. In any case, so they looked at things, and a lot of these older scholars see things entirely through the state. The younger scholars, it depends on. I would say that actually, I don't like to use Burma studies because that goes back to a very narrow group that are all built around Aung San Suu Kyi and anyway, the thing is, but people who are involved in analyzing Burma, who don't do things just through Burma studies, but they do things from political science and IR and other things, and Burma is just one of a number of different places they look at. The field has grown, that intersection on Myanmar has grown much, much richer. So we have multiple groups, and that's been one of the better things, is that it's possible now for some people to have a more critical approach without being totally left out of every conference and association workshop and everything else. In the old practice was if you deviate at all from the standard narrative of the cult, you aren't included in the conversation, and that's changed a little bit, although you still see efforts to try to silence that kind of criticism. I would say I'm not going to be critical of Thein Sein, but I would try to understand his perspective from him having come from an elite background, and and I think his narrative about Burma reflects how things look from a elite, involved in the state, diplomatic perspective, educated at Cambridge. I mean, this is not an everyday Burmese point of view. And so I would not take his view at face value as representing the majority even of Burmars. I would just take it as one narrative that can't encapsulate adequately other understandings of Burmese history. And that's one of the problems, actually, because his books are so popular that you have people like Bernard Lintner saying, if you want to understand Burma, this is read Freedom from Fear and this book by Thein Sein and a couple others, and you understand Burma. No, you just have just a very narrow glimpse at what is necessary to understand the complicated world that Burmese politics and history and everything else is. And Thein, I don't think he makes any secret in his it was his second or third book. He doesn't make any secret that his perspective on Burma is very heavily intertwined with his family's history. That's what his book was about, was a mixing of family history and his perspectives on Burma. So I would just try to understand these different points of view as different intellectual takes. We need other intellectual takes. We need to understand, for example, Rohingya views, not as being, these, not just as genocidal victims, but as part of everyday Burmese views. Their perspective, because they're Muslim, doesn't mean that they aren't Burmese. And that's the thing.
Well, I think it seems like you're talking. I mean, me talking about Burmese politics is like talking about family business. Thein Sein's family and mine from his father's side. His father grew up in the next neighborhood in Mandalay, right by the Palace Moat, and then our four parents worked in the inner circle of the kings in Burma, before the colonization in 1885. And so we go back 6 generations here. But I think the Thein Sein's problem is that he takes a very neo-feudal court historical perspective on things Burma, and also he's never been part of like the democratic struggle. He made a talk about it because his parents lived in Bangkok at the time. ABSDF was formed, and there was a traffic among some of the student revolutionary coming to see the parents and whatnot. But he isn't rooted, the same way Aung San Suu Kyi is not rooted in the Burmese commoners' experience, right? She can never understand why, the former political prisoners, upon release, would want to tend to the family business of feeding and clothing their children and old parents, right? Yeah. She turned her back towards them the minute that they refused to make further sacrifices for democratization. These are not, like you said, neither Aung San Suu Kyi nor Thein Sein can speak for Burma. I mean, this may sound shocking.
That's part of the problem of perspective with Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's why I wish people abroad who just keep on part of Aung San Suu Kyi that they just realize that she's not Burma, and she doesn't represent most Burmese voices.
Mike,
to give you some examples,
sorry.
No.
Carry on.
Oh, I was going to say one of the outcomes of this is that she doesn't understand what everyday Burmese and everyday Burmese civil societies go through. And so it hasn't bothered her when journalists have been arrested or civil societies have been cowed into not dealing with certain subjects, or that civil liberties for everyday people have been rolled back, because she, as part of the elite group, has never suffered from those things. She's never been constrained. She doesn't understand. And in terms of everyday wealth, right? I think maybe you were starting to hint to that. There was a point when she was telling civil servants who were going to Naypyidaw when it was first being built to tighten their belt and deal with the low wages, where she's never had to do that. She's lauded with presents and free gifts, and throughout her time abroad, the Burmese embassies everywhere she went took care of her as the daughter of the national founder.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, she is basically, she's cut from the same elite, cloth as generals in Burma today. Yeah, and except that these two, and in particular, let's focus on how Tamiu is less important in the grander scheme of things. Suu Kyi never struggled to feed her children. Her children are basically trust fund children. They had enough money to survive, or like they've got other trade, right? And then herself, this is a woman. I mean, again, zero malice here on my part. Factually speaking, how many Burmese dissidents were put under house arrest during which they played Beethoven and listen to Desert Island? Beethoven on piano, right? I mean, like, so so we have a serious problem that the leading spokespersons of Burmese affairs or state affairs or democracy or like civil society have nothing in common with the people for whom they say they're fighting for. And by the same token, we have a situation of entire assemblage of Burma scholars and experts who frown upon, if not deride, scholars on the ground that may be directly involved, who may get their hands dirty, in the struggle, and then there's another layer of usurpation of the voices, yeah, and then a few select quotes by the dissident scholars may be used when they suit the agenda of the Foreign Office in London or State Department in Washington, but they're never really listened to, yeah, and if you're listened to, because what you are saying supports or advances a policy objective, not because what you're saying has inherent political inherent intellectual and analytical value. Yeah, and so there's this thing happening within the domain of knowledge production. People who are not properly professorial or academic attached to the academic institutions, they are dismissed, out of hand. Whereas in fact, people who sip tea and fly in for 3 months and come back out and write a book, and their words become authoritative. How do we tackle this issue? Because we're in the area of decolonizing knowledge, and we have this colonial situation in the Burma knowledge production industry.
Well, one of the problems with decolonization, and decolonization, I agree with a lot of principles, but the way it's too simplistic, and it views only, we need to go for indigenous views as opposed to Western views. And actually, the problem is the indigenous views that are often accessed are also elite views within their own country. They have their own internal colonialism. So I think what we need to do is we need to bring more ethnic minority speakers who aren't necessarily elite, right? So ex-SOAS or something. We need to bring in a wider economic, social, and ethnic cross-section of Burmese society. We need to access their views and make them as accessible as possible, find ways that they can have a voice, find a voice for everyday agriculturalists and so on. These are the people who are left out. If all we do is we just juggle between outside experts who happen to pop in and Burmese elites who are part of the government. So many of these Burmese experts they ask, I've seen so many things where it's not naming names, but almost in every case they're this advisor to the government, or they're in this ministry. There are so many other voices. Why are you going just to government employees? I mean, of course you're going to get a pro-state point of view when you go to those. And so you have pro-state Burmese talking to pro-state Westerners, and you come out with a pro-state perspective, and people are fed that as being a truly representative point of view. And it's the most misleading point of view you can have. It will favor the status quo. It won't. So we need to really reconstruct the way that people are doing the research on Burma. We need to find a way to give. You need to find a way. Okay, the fundamental thing we need to have is we need a Burmese leader who's actually going to stand up for a real civil for real liberal democracy in Burma, for an inclusive Burma that includes Rohingya, and doesn't spend most of its time talking about how she doesn't think that there's really ethnic cleansing or genocide going on in Rakhine. We need to grow a real intellectual class around what exists right now, but is suppressed, that's not dominated in a hierarchy-like fashion, authoritarian-like fashion by people like Aung San Suu Kyi. We need to have people who, everyday Burmese intellectuals, who can have the speaker as well, the platform as well. These are the things. So this will only come if we come up with a new constitution and the military is pushed out of control and we have a leader who's interested in more than building up her own cult of personality.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, if there is to be a silver lining, yeah, that silver lining has to be one, the burial of this big lie that Burma is moving in the democratic direction. That's proven wrong yesterday after 10 years for some of us screaming foul about this, yeah. From the margins. And then the other one is that I think there has to be revival of civil society movements, yeah. And I don't mean civil society as in like a list of NGOs and CBO that you can go to get signatures for certain statements that Western NGOs drafted, right? And I mean organic civil society that do not simply parrot the language of sustainable development or like gender equality. You know what I mean? Like,
this deracinated so that we don't have them biased against, like, how can you have a real civil society group that's focused on civil liberties that openly says they hate Muslims? I mean, give me a break. We need something. Yeah. Okay. Please go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's very offensive what they do.
I know. I'm just saying that I think like, organic civil society, with this kind of progressive orientation, you cannot, I mean, civil society can be good and bad, I mean, like civil society was involved in Nazi genocide, the same way the Burmese civil society of Buddhist majority have been cheerleading the Rohingya genocide, right? And then so I think, so I mean, I brought this up because like, because we are going to enter a new phase of opposition movement building. And there is going to be money, yeah, because like the China factor will always be there. So there'll be Western in quotes donors coming in wanting to support pro Aung San Suu Kyi civil society movements, right? And they're going to that money has to come with certain ideological orientation. That money has to support not just simply everyone who claims to be a civil society actor, but the one that really embrace the inclusive vision of what post Aung San Suu Kyi, post-military Burma is going to look like. And otherwise we're going to just repeat the same thing. The civil society actors will be in quotes discovered and adopted and paraded around in Western fora where they will be presented as spokesperson, right? Because another type of like misrepresentation of Burma, urbanite Burmese speaking for the entire country with a very narrow democratic pro human rights vision.
That's why I think that international funders and international organizations, they need to find grassroots organizations, people who have already been struggling in very adverse conditions before, that have a track record of promoting the kinds of, because like you're saying, I think actually what's going to happen as soon as this money's available, suddenly all these people are suddenly going to be interested in civil rights and suddenly we need to have tolerance, but only because the money's available. When the money disappears, then so do those intentions that they have. There are enough, if you look hard enough, there are enough people in Burma who are already doing the right thing at all different levels that you can look and find the legitimate ones right now and empower them. Don't tell them what to do, but empower them on the track that they're trying to take in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, like so far what I've seen is this, like, ticking the NGO boxes, right? And then the donors come in with their own agenda. If they talk to you, that's to legitimize their perspective, not to incorporate your the perspective into their analyses and priorities. So that's why, the donor speak is always our partners, right? I mean, you can't have partnership when the power relations so unequal, right? You can yank their chains the minute you say, like, oh, we may have to cut your funding, or we're going to stop the funding, and that's when you show who's the boss.
Right, and it'll make things more effective if they work through pre-existing grassroots leaders. What I think is effective to point out is, after years and years and years of this kind of investment in civil societies, according to the old model, we had all the Islamic phobia and racist crowds and everything. Where was this new group that they were trying to develop earlier, who would fight for civil liberties for everybody? They didn't exist. So where did all that funding go for all those years? What did all those programs result in? Nothing.
Yeah.
So this time it has to be effective.
Yeah. The one final question to you. I mean, you have trained over the last 20, 25 years, trained so many young Southeast Asian scholars, and including Burmese, right? What's your advice to them, in terms of going forward as say knowledge workers, intellectuals, for lack of a better term?
I think the most important thing is not to promote a particular agenda, except so far as you get Burmese to look critically at all the issues and always criticize the government and avoid this kind of cult of personality. Don't be political in your constructions of history so it suits the powers that be, because a lot of the histories we have done that. Always be critical and raise questions, and certainly the one thing I would advocate people pursue is that they pursue tolerance and the promotion of civil liberties, and a different idea of what Burma is. They can decide what Burma is, but it can't be narrowly fixated on the Burmar Buddhist Burmese speakers. Myanmar is not going to survive if it has such a narrow colonial remit about its country and its culture and its civilization now.
Yeah, my own experience is to use the academic jargon, we need to decenter the Burmese identity, and we need to decenter the state.
Reimagine
and
it.
we exactly. We have to erase the center peripheral perspective, and also I think the gravest sin an intellectual or a scholar can make is position him or her interest in the analyses and scholarship that one may conduct or produce. That is what blinds the scholar from the verifiable realities, and they can go on for decades. The people who study this is ridiculous. This may sound ridiculous. You can study a country for 50 years and still has a completely wrong interpretations of things and institutions. Yeah.
Right. I agree. So I have another appointment, so I'm going to thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been very stimulating, and we will continue. We have this democratization talk on the Thailand and Burma and Cambodia. I think on the 8th of February, the two of us. Yeah.
I'll see you then.
Thanks so much, Mike. This has been very, very stimulating.
Thanks, Dr. Zarni.